Today's talk, Toward a Green New Future. Sorry about the earlier technical difficulties. For those of you who don't know, my name is Sydney Gazarian, and I'm a climate organizer who helped start the Democratic Socialists of America Eco-Socialist Working Group, and I'm currently co-coordinating DSA's Green New Deal campaign. Today, I'll be moderating a panel with Daniel Aldana Cohen and Thea Riofrancos on building eco-socialism during the climate emergency. Daniel Aldana Cohen is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, where he directs the Sociospatial Climate Collaborative. He serves on the policy team of People's Action Home Guarantee Campaign, is a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, and led the research for the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act, as proposed by Representative Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Sanders. He is the co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal. Thea Riofrancos is an assistant professor of political science at Providence College. She is the author of Resource Radicals, From Petro-Nationalism to Post-Extractivism in Ecuador, and the co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal. She serves on the steering committee of DSA's Eco-Socialist Working Group. So we're going to start off with this panel by hearing opening remarks from Daniel, followed by Thea, and then I'll jump into moderating a panel discussion. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Daniel. Please take it away. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Sid. Thank you, Thea. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your revolutionary patience, comrades, as we sort out technical difficulties. I'm sure we'll have some of those after the revolution, too. So get to train now. So it's a real honor to speak with all of you. As Sid said, we're in an emergency. We're in, obviously, a climate emergency. And of course, we're in the long-running emergencies of capitalism and of white supremacy and all the violence that goes with both of those systems. So what I want to talk about today is how we as socialists can engage in that, but I want to do it in a slightly circuitous route, taking inspiration from my comrades in the housing movement and many climate organizers. I'm going to try to work through some of my own personal story and to think about how I got myself into the struggle, where my kind of common sense of what a Green New Deal movement or an eco-socialist movement could look like, where that comes from. And also, I think there is something to these personal narratives that help us find the part in us that connects to the struggle and that helps us kind of fight day in, day out, keep getting out of bed in the morning and staying in this movement. I don't normally tell these stories, but since I'm a revolutionary and revolutionaries have to do new things all the time, this is part of that. My father was Jewish and raised in Canada. He grew up there. My mother is Guatemalan, and she was born and raised in Guatemala to a Guatemalan father and to an American mother. She was born in the mid-40s, and by the early 50s, her uncle, Carlos, my great-uncle, was the Minister of Public Works in the democratically elected socialist government of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala. Now, this government was undertaking massive land reform, and this threatened the corporate interests of the United Fruit Company. And on behalf of the United Fruit Company, in 1954, the CIA sponsored a coup in Guatemala to depose the socialist government. The night of the coup, my grandfather had to go track down my uncle, who was a minister in the government, my great uncle, hide him in the trunk of my grandfather's car, and then smuggle him in to the Salvadorian embassy. My great uncle was extremely lucky to escape with his life. He went into exile. He eventually returned to Guatemala and lived in a kind of de facto house arrest for the rest of his life, living off of the beauty salon that his wife ran in the basement. I think a lesson that we could learn from as we develop our feminist struggles. I grew up hearing stories of this coup in Guatemala, its impact on my family, the subsequent genocide in Guatemala, the murder of hundreds of thousands of indigenous peoples. And this blended seamlessly into the stories that I heard about the Holocaust from the Jewish side of my family. And I think that having a sort of experience, personal, visceral experience of my family's relationship to these kinds of massive global atrocities and violence and global inequality and American imperialism actually made it easier to assimilate and understand what the climate emergency was fundamentally about, a story of life and death, where most people are faced with the suspension of the conditions for living, and certainly for living well. And I'm not alone, I think, in this recognition. Within the United States, far more Latino and Black Americans believe in and worry about climate change than white Americans. And if you leave the United States and go around the world, countries of the global south, far greater numbers worry about climate change. They understand that this is a struggle for life and death, and they understand where the United States and where the capitalist class fit into that struggle. Because of my mother's history, I spent a lot of time in Bolivia and Venezuela when I was younger after college as a journalist, working with water warriors and coca leaf growers. And then for the last decade in Sao Paulo with the militant housing movement, largely led by women of color, squatting dozens of buildings at a time in downtown Sao Paulo and terrains in the periphery of the city. And for these movements, I think what is striking when you leave the US is that in a kind of non-neurotic way, they just understand that democracy and socialism are the same struggle. They understand that environmental justice and socialism and anti-imperialism are the same struggle. They don't always use the same words, and of course they have arguments about it, but there is this fundamental understanding, and they understand that that then means a struggle for power. It means engaging with the formal political system, engaging with political parties, making alliances with members of the middle class who are sympathetic. It means dancing together, it means drinking together, it means studying together, it means living together. It's a dedication to a lifelong struggle because that is the only way that these movements' members understand that they will ultimately survive and flourish. There is a lot that we can learn in the United States from the struggles of movements in Latin America, from progressive socialist governments in Latin America, as they have tried to do what the Green New Deal movement is catching up to, which is make the case for large, massive public investment and for democratizing the economy from the ground up. Let me tell you a bit about what I've learned about this from the housing movement in Sao Paulo. I remember very well an event late in June in 2013, so about 7 years ago. It was an event in the city council chambers in Sao Paulo, and what happened was basically there was more and more interest in kind of decarbonizing the city, a lot of it coming from green capital, a lot of it resulting from extreme weather. And the housing movement realized we need to be a part of this, and in fact, we need to impose our vision. So the city council invited the housing movement and some representatives from NGOs and a representative from the European Union to the city council. The hosts were blown away because 1,000 rank and file members of the housing movement showed up. They filled the main auditorium of the city council. They filled an overflow room, and hundreds of them stood and listened on loudspeakers to the speeches outside. And up on the kind of dais, up on at the panel, one of the leaders of the housing movement forcefully made the case that the low carbon city is a city where working class people live downtown, near the subway, near their jobs, where they can get around. The low carbon city for the housing movement was fundamentally a city of the right to housing in central areas and in areas that are close to services that people need and close to jobs. Easy car-free commutes are essential for working class people in Sao Paulo, something they don't have right now. And so the European Union's representative, she was nodding politely, seemed interested in this discourse. And then you saw the other face of the housing movement, not just the intelligent policy face, but the organizing face. And a woman got up and led the whole auditorium in the characteristic chant of this movement, which goes, the person leading the chant says, "Quem não luta," and everybody who screams back, "Tá morto." "Quem não luta, tá morto," which means those who don't struggle are dead. And to hear 300 people shouting "are dead" in the kind of chandelier, covered chambers of the city council is a lot. And the woman from the European Union's face looked like she had just accidentally stumbled into a human sacrifice ceremony, and she was really not prepared for this. She was down for the low carbon analysis, but she was shocked by this intensity of struggle. And in fact, virtually every meeting of this housing movement, this chant occurs. The name of the housing movement's newsletter is "Quem não luta tá morto." Those who don't struggle are dead. And this was a lesson that I've taken back to the US. And everything I've written and done in terms of the idea of a Green New Deal for housing comes from these two core insights. One is that we have to impose a working class vision of decarbonization. It won't come naturally. It has to be imposed. And the second is that this is fundamentally about struggle, and it's a struggle over life and death. That's what it means to fight against eviction in the United States right now. It's a struggle for life over death. And once you commit to merging the struggle for decarbonization with the struggle for life, for working class people, for very poor people, then the policy details will follow. Indeed, when we created the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act, and I was very lucky to work with AOC's office in particular, what we did is we spent a lot of time with residents of NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority, public housing in New York, and then we went to green architects and said, these are the needs of the people on the ground. This is what they're facing in their everyday reality. What are the solutions that you can propose to meet those needs, assuming massive public investment? And that's how you generate the policy ideas. You don't start with the bullet points. You start on the ground with the struggle, and the bullet points and the PDFs and all of that follow. And indeed, I think that what kind of comes from this is that we're never going to settle in a debate in Democratic Left or in Jacobin or anywhere else what socialism is or what eco-socialism is. Socialism or eco-socialism is the living multiracial movement of working people forged in collective struggle to fundamentally transform and democratize the economy, to protect every single person from violence and abuse, from anti-Black police violence. Eco-socialism is about guaranteeing the conditions for human and non-human life flourishing for as long as anybody can imagine. Now, this is this big picture framework. And I think we think of the Green New Deal, and I think Thea would agree with me, we think of the Green New Deal not as the totality of eco-socialism, but as hopefully a 20 or 30-year framework where we move to decarbonize incredibly rapidly in a way that lifts up workers and communities, that fundamentally transforms how the economy is governed. Does this generate the full eco-socialist vision at the end? I don't know, but it's definitely the step we have to take forward now. And to get there, again, we have to work with the struggles that are happening right now, the rebellion against police violence, a multiracial rebellion, but also a Black-led rebellion. We have to work with it. And I think it's actually an incredible time, and it's beautiful to watch so many people, I think, joining this fight, turning to thinkers like W.B. Du Bois, among many, many, many thinkers, as we try to understand in American history, not just the lessons of the New Deal or the war on poverty, which were in many ways failures, especially for Black Americans, but what is a kind of common sense and intuition of how we combine our struggles. So I want to read a bit from Du Bois, his chapter on Black labor, kind of canonical chapter from Black Reconstruction, where he situates what we might call now the movement for Black lives within a global context, including a context of struggles over resources, struggles that are very familiar to us now. So in this chapter, Du Bois writes, it was thus the Black worker as founding stone of a new economic system in the 19th century and for the modern world who brought civil war in America. He was its underlying cause. And Du Bois is showing that even though Black workers are in the minority, the way that they are treated is at the absolute core of American capitalism. And then later in the book, Du Bois goes on to show that the general strike of Black workers, including Black slaves, was the essential, decisive sort of phenomenon that gave the North the victory, that defeated the Confederacy, was Black workers and Black slaves revolting against their masters and joining the fight for their own lives against the death of slavery and the Confederacy. Du Bois continues in the same chapter. He pivots right away from the US to the global scene. He says that dark and vast sea of human labor in China and India, the South Seas and all Africa, and the West Indies and Central America, and in the United States, that great majority of mankind on whose bent and broken backs rest today the founding stones of modern industry, shares a common destiny. The great majority shares a common destiny. It is despised and rejected by race and color, paid a wage below the level of decent living, driven, beaten, imprisoned, and enslaved in all but name, spawning the world's raw material and luxury, cotton, wool, coffee, tea, cocoa, palm oil, fibers, spices, rubber, silks, lumber, copper, gold, diamonds, leather. How shall we end the list and where, he asks. We could add coal and gas and oil, but we could also, looking at green capitalism, add to this list lithium, cobalt, neodymium, and all the other rare earth minerals. And then Du Bois continues, all these are gathered up at prices lowest of the low. Warning, don't fight the Green New Deal on the basis of low cost. All these are gathered up at prices lowest of the low, manufactured and transformed and transported at fabulous gain, and the resultant wealth is distributed and displayed and made the basis of world power and universal dominion in London and Paris, Berlin, Rome, New York, and Rio de Janeiro. The emancipation of man, he says, is the emancipation of labor, and the emancipation of labor is the freeing of that basic majority of workers who are yellow, brown, and Black. And so I think what I take from Du Bois and what is so essential is that the movement for Black lives now and for Black labor as then is not a sideshow to the class struggle. It's not a secondary issue. It's not the only issue. It is the leading moment, certainly within the United States, of the working class struggle to transform the economy, to transform our relationship to the stuff of non-human nature, the stuff that is the basis of our life. And that will be true under eco-socialism as well, because we will need resources to create energy, to create homes, and so on. So I think that where we are now in the US is the need to create a common sense and understanding that eco-socialism, that the movement for Black lives, anti-imperialism are all the same thing. We have to fight very hard to transform our economic systems, to join our struggles together, to recognize across all the kind of barriers that have so far kept us apart, that those who don't struggle are dead. Quem não luta está morto. People living in boardrooms, sitting in boardrooms, and people living in situation rooms will not save us. Only we will save ourselves. I think that as we move together as eco-socialists in the movement for Black lives, we will learn how to win, and in doing so, we'll learn how to live. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was amazing, and I'm going to keep up, or sort of keep in with some of the themes that you established, and hopefully not repeat too much. There's a couple of resonances, but I'll take it from a slightly different angle. So, um, I'm going to start with, I think, what our common sense is now about the Green New Deal, which is that we tend to think of the Green New Deal as a set of domestic policies that will usher in a low carbon and egalitarian society in the United States. Today, I'll argue, kind of again picking up on some themes that Daniel already established, that we shouldn't evaluate the Green New Deal in domestic terms alone. The principle of global climate justice demands that we take an internationalist perspective on the climate policies that we advocate for. And second, and relatedly, I'll argue that an eco-socialist Green New Deal, as opposed to more centrist or liberal or other versions of the Green New Deal, that an eco-socialist Green New Deal offers concrete proposals that simultaneously address the local, national, and global dimensions of the climate crisis. In this sense, an eco-socialist Green New Deal is inspired by the Black radical tradition that Daniel just ended his talk with, and also with the third world Marxist traditions that Daniel also alluded to, which see the liberation of workers and communities around the world as bound up together and part of the same process. So to make this more concrete, I want to sketch out two different geographic sites of environmental injustice in the world, and then I'm going to hopefully show how they are connected and how an eco-socialist Green New Deal that we fight for in the US would mitigate, ameliorate, and those forms of injustice and lift up these different communities around the globe. So first, and to start with kind of where Daniel was reflecting on in terms of Latin America, is the devastation caused by rapacious resource extraction. So across the global South and in Latin America, where I've done a lot of solidarity work and research for many years and where my family immigrated from, communities are burdened with the social and ecological harm of fossil capitalism. The indigenous, campesino, working class mestizo communities who live near oil, gas, and mining projects suffer water, air, and soil contamination and the destruction of local ecosystems. These projects also threaten pre-existing livelihoods, violate indigenous rights, and often displace communities entirely from their land. Unsurprisingly, social movements have risen up to contest these projects. From Chile to Ecuador to Peru to Argentina, movements have battled oil and mining companies on extremely asymmetric terrain and faced the retaliatory violence of state and paramilitary forces, yet in several cases succeeded in obstructing the expansion of the extractive frontier. I want to note right away something that Daniel already mentioned, which is that these injustices won't simply disappear as the world moves from fossil fuels towards renewables. It goes without saying that a rapid reduction in carbon emissions, first and foremost in the United States, the world's largest emitter, is a key demand of the climate justice movement. We do need to move towards renewables. We know that carbon emissions affect, first and foremost, marginalized people in the world who suffer the worst consequences of climate chaos while being the least responsible for it. So I don't want to downplay the necessity of a rapid transition to renewables. But we also need to be honest about the material transformation entailed by such a rapid transition. To capture, store, and distribute energy from the sun and wind, we need wind turbines, solar panels, and huge lithium batteries. We also need to electrify entire sectors of the economy and build a massive infrastructure of transmission lines. All of these changes to our built environment require natural resources extracted from the earth. For example, electric cars require 180 pounds of copper each, as well as lithium, cobalt, nickel, and more. So a world of renewable energy, as Daniel mentioned, is still a world of resource extraction. And for communities in the global South, of the environmental and social devastation such extraction has entailed. Now I want to move on to another site of injustice here in the United States. As environmental justice movements rooted in Black and Brown communities and indigenous nations have long shown, racialized and poor people are subject to the toxic harms of our energy system. Transmission lines, power plants, liquefied natural gas facilities, petrochemical refineries, coal mines, and polluting factories of all sorts are disproportionately sited in areas considered disposable by the powers that be. From Louisiana to Los Angeles to South Philadelphia to Flint, those who live in these sacrifice zones are exposed to toxic contamination, causing disproportionate rates of respiratory illness and cancer, and depriving them of the basic right to clean air and water. This environmental racism, of course, is a key cause of the high rates of COVID infection and death affecting people of color. In addition to suffering those environmental harms and those public health crises, many of these same communities suffer from what's called energy poverty. They pay large portions of their income for the essential services of energy and water. Energy poverty is a result of rates that are too high in the first place, but also a result of inefficiencies that come from lack of proper insulation and weatherization in working class homes. When the bills stack up, households face the risk of shutoffs by the private for-profit utilities that they pay. Going without electricity, water, or gas means no cooked food, exposure to extreme hot or cold temperatures, of course, increasingly an issue with global warming, no hot showers, no charging your phone or laptop or anything. It means denying people the basics of survival. And for those that rely on medical equipment to stay alive, shutoffs have proven deadly. So with these two sites of environmental injustice in mind, the first in communities affected by extraction in Latin America, and the second communities affected by environmental injustice in the US, I want to turn to the second part of my argument. As geographically distant as they might seem, the fates of frontline communities in Latin America and frontline communities in the United States are deeply interconnected. Both are shaped by a system of racial capitalism that externalizes social and environmental costs onto the most marginalized. The flip side is that a holistic, radical, and internationalist Green New Deal, rooted in the principles of eco-socialism, offers a political vision that addresses these root causes. An eco-socialist Green New Deal recognizes that it isn't enough to simply swap out fossil fuels for renewables while maintaining rapacious extraction, unsustainable growth, and the overconsumption of the affluent. And so this is, what we might see as like a faux or fake Green New Deal, or as kind of just green capitalism, which is just swapping out the energy source but not changing any other aspect of the system. We can't address the climate crisis by leaving intact the system that caused it in the first place. Instead, our action on climate change needs to simultaneously chip away at the foundations of capitalist domination and racist oppression. So in that spirit, an eco-socialist Green New Deal would not trust, for example, the fossil fuel companies that caused the climate crisis in the first place to implement the energy transition out of their own goodwill. We need public control over these companies in order to phase them out, while ensuring a just transition for workers in this sector. And I'll note that at this particular moment of crisis for oil, gas, and coal markets, there's no better moment to nationalize the industry with the goal of keeping fossil fuels in the ground where they belong. The same principle of public control goes for another bad actor in our energy system, the currently private for-profit utility companies that dominate our energy landscape. For decades, these private utilities have used every trick in the book, from lobbying to AstroTurf campaigns, to stall the transition to renewables. And they have perpetuated energy poverty, charging ratepayers unaffordable rates and failing to invest in energy efficiency or weatherization, thereby also exacerbating environmental racism. We need public utilities to democratize, decommodify, decarbonize, and decolonize our energy systems. Relatedly, we need to move away from the system of privatized car-centric transit by massively investing in green public transit, and ditto for green social housing. Adopting these changes in the energy system and built environment will also benefit people in the global south who live near the sites of resource extraction. If we just switch renewables for fossil fuels but leave current patterns of consumption unchanged, then the communities who live near copper or lithium mines, which, as I said, are required for electric vehicles, for the big lithium batteries that we need for renewable grids, and for the materials that create solar panels and transmission lines, will continue to suffer harm. Instead, we need to use resources more rationally by using them collectively. And I love to use the example of an electric bus, which is a much more rational use of resources than an electric car, individual private electric car is. We need to reduce overall energy consumption at the same time making it more equal. And we need to address the main culprit, which is, of course, the overconsumption of the rich, and ensure that public housing and public schools, areas that Daniel has worked a lot on, are low carbon, which will also bring immediate health benefits to those neighborhoods. Lastly, and I'll close out here in a kind of similar spirit that Daniel did, As the Black uprising is demanding in the streets, we need to overall reorient our economic priorities. So to kind of illustrate this, I want to quote directly from the Movement for Black Lives Matter platform, because I think their words draw out the themes of interconnectedness, the way the domestic is always the global, and the fates of racialized and working class communities across the planet are interconnected, that Daniel and I have focused on today. So I quote, "We demand investments in the education, health, and safety of Black people instead of investments in the criminalizing, caging, and harming of Black people. We want investments in Black communities determined by Black communities and divestment from exploitative forces, including prisons, fossil fuels, police, surveillance, and exploitative corporations." Such a reorientation away from the carceral state and fossil capitalism and towards care and socio-environmental flourishing will lift up communities in the US and will contribute to climate justice and solidarity at a global scale. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for your opening remarks and really grounding us in this moment. Really everything that we're up against and the radical possibilities that are within arm's reach. Given the time crunch, I'm just going to go ahead and jump straight into questions. I really appreciate that you two kicked off this conversation on climate with an international lens, not only because this is clearly a global emergency, but because the role of the US in perpetuating this crisis and undermining international climate efforts is often overlooked in discussions about what federal climate policy should entail. So, building on your open remarks, what are the top specific policy demands US-based climate activists and socialists need to make in order to enable global climate justice and further develop the power of the international left? And how can we turn the US-based movement for a Green New Deal into the international leftist movement we need now?
I think that I'll just get started on that and then let Daniel pick up. I think that we need to firmly ground ourselves in internationalism, as we've said, but not think that internationalism with climate politics means like being like big fans of like the Paris Accords, right? Like obviously we know that the international agreements that have been written thus far and agreed upon by countries in the world, by governments in the world, are terrible agreements. They're not fast enough. They're not binding. They're like written by the major polluters. The fossil fuel companies lobby at them. Like they're not a route forward for internationalism. So instead of that, I think we need to think concretely about what a different world order would look like, a world order that actually would mitigate the climate crisis and lift up communities, both environmentally and economically. And so there are a lot of interesting stuff out there that I suggest folks read about like how canceling debt is like a key part, canceling sovereign debt, which is something that prevents governments in the global south from actually using resources to address human and environmental needs, and instead goes to sustaining unsustainable debt levels, is a key demand of the climate justice movement, to think about those two things together. Another thing that I'll just mention briefly is thinking about how to totally transform trade. As leftists, I don't think we should shy away from making bold demands around trade. We shouldn't think that trade automatically has to be right-wing and neoliberal, right? There are forms of cultural and economic encounter and exchange that we should value as leftists and also understand are just necessary in order to physically build the world that we want to build. And so what would left-wing trade look like? What principles would it be based on? How can trade be a vehicle for working class empowerment and for indigenous rights and the protection of indigenous territory rather than the opposite of that? So I just sort of put those 2 pointers to begin with, and I'm sure Daniel has more to add.
Thanks. No, that's exactly right. I think maybe a couple of things to add. The United States has emitted more carbon than any other country in history. If you add up all the emissions that have ever been emitted, carbon emissions in the last 200 or so years, over a fifth of those have been emitted in the territory of the United States. So we have to decarbonize really first. And insofar as the Democratic Party is putting forth plans that say this is consistent with Paris because we're going to reach net zero by 2050 along with the rest of the world, that's not really the way that it should go. We need to decarbonize years ahead of other countries to keep space in the atmosphere for fossil fuels and other places that don't have the capacity to transition as quickly as we do. So I think one key aspect of internationalism is simply the domestic politics, which is decarbonizing at breakneck speed. And another piece, just to, I think, deepen a point that Thea made, is we have to make available the technologies that emerge from our own investments here to the rest of the world. Now, we live in a global market, and I don't think that selling solar panels to France at market rate is like a problem if we develop something like that in the US. That's fine. But that's not the case for the global south. We've had major struggles for life in countries like India, South Africa, and Brazil for access, for instance, HIV medications at affordable rates, and the suspension of patents from industrial policy in the north in countries of the global south. And that is correct. And we should now be making sure that there are no IP, intellectual property restrictions whatsoever on US technologies in the global south. Again, I think being real, like if the EU and the United States want to charge each other an arm and a leg for their technology, fine. I mean, the priority is making sure that these things are available to the rest of the world. So I think, obviously a huge part of internationalism is cooperating. In the book, we talk about the need for internationalism along the supply chain for frontline communities to talk to each other. But I think at the end of the day, the biggest amount of effort is going to be within national borders, and we have to align our domestic politics with the needs of people elsewhere, which means decarbonizing first and fastest, which means making all the benefits of our own investments available for free elsewhere. And third, I think it also means being humble enough to learn from other countries and knowing that the New Deal is not the only source of inspiration for democratic economic policymaking. One could go on, but that's what I would throw out initially.
Awesome, thank you both. So speaking of democratic policymaking, the Democrats recently released a climate action plan that both demonstrates how far the climate movement has managed to push them on policy while still falling woefully short of what is necessary to prevent catastrophic global heating and mass extinctions. Could you both talk about the ways the Democrats' climate plan falls short and the eco-socialist policies we should be implementing instead?
I'll just say two ways I think it falls short. And I think the second one, hopefully, is something that Daniel can expand on a little bit because he's more expert on it than I am. But I think the first is the timeline. And that actually immediately picks up on something that Daniel just was saying, which is that our first, the first thing that we do to enact global climate justice in the US is pressure the US government, corporations, et cetera, to move as fast as possible towards decarbonization. And so anything that is slower than the science demands is for me, consigning peoples and ecosystems around the world and in the US to death, right? And so it's extremely important that we are very aggressive in our timelines. And so 2040 for the electricity sector is just it's a bonkers timeline. It's not what the science says, and it's not what global justice demands. And so it's a timeline that falls short of what the Sunrise Movement, what DSA, what environmental justice communities have been calling for, right? And so the timeline is just not fast enough. The second piece, which if he wants to, Daniel can expand on a little bit more, is just the orientation towards nudges and nice incentives and away from regulations that force firms to do things that if they do not do them, they pay the price in whatever way. Either their activities are illegal, they pay a huge fine, a hesitation around using the full enforcement powers of the state to actually push the economy in this direction. And instead, you get a tax break if you do the right thing, but maybe nothing happens if you do the wrong thing, right? And so I think there's this sort of milquetoast centrism and hesitation around the use of power that is a kind of deeper problem throughout the Climate Crisis Committee's plan.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't have a super detailed critique of each element. It's a mixed bag. The Green Deal for Public Housing Act seems to be mentioned, but at the same time, the building stuff overall seems largely to be incentive-based, which is not fast enough. The core point, I think as Thea already mentioned, is that it presents a plan to decarbonize the power sector, the electricity sector by 2040, when you have very credible plans already for, from the Warren Inslee wing of the party, 2035, what do you need an extra 5 years for? And what that tells you is that it's fundamentally not an emergency mobilization on the model of the US war economy, which obviously problematic in a million ways, but gets right this idea that you don't start by saying, oh, I need an exact path on my graph to get 100% of the way there. You start by saying, this is the single number one priority, and we're going to move hell and earth to get there. And one part of doing that is setting a shorter timeline. Every timeline that's further away is just for procrastination. We didn't really get into this, but this plan does not talk about things like sharing intellectual property. On the contrary, it's the language of American leadership in energy and so on. I think the last thing to emphasize is that this plan comes out of a committee that was set up as a way to screw over AFC and the Green New Deal movement. What happened, and people have mentioned this in the history, and there's already been some revisionism, AOC got elected, she demanded a select committee on the Green New Deal with subpoena power, which is what gives committees in Congress teeth. It means they can bring people up and grill them in Congress and get documents that they wouldn't otherwise be able to get. And instead, we had this committee, which did not have the same requirement for lack of fossil fuel funding among leaders of the committee, did not have subpoena power, and produced a document that has some good things in it, but I don't think really represents the Green New Deal's core elements. The last thing I'll say, this plan doesn't have a jobs guarantee inside of it, which again should be a no-brainer. If you're willing to spend gazillions of dollars, you might as well add the jobs guarantee because it's going to cost at the margin practically nothing in addition. So I think, Sid, the way you phrase it is exactly right. It is a demonstration of how far we've come in the last couple of years, and it's also, I think, a sober reminder that we're very far from having won. And I don't, the biggest mistake we would make is to see this as the farthest we could get in the next year. I don't think that's the case at all. That's being set up to prevent us from fighting for more. As Thea's written on Twitter, you know, when you get a victory like this on the left, you escalate. You don't congratulate yourself. This is not a time for self-congratulation. I mean, look, you got through a day, COVID, it's hard. Obviously, congratulate yourself. But I mean, as a movement, you know, we gotta keep going.
Awesome. Great answers. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and kind of tap back into something you both brought up during your opening remarks. So the recent Black Lives Matter uprisings have dramatically expanded public engagement in racial justice struggles and the struggle against state repression. What lessons should the climate movement take away from these uprisings on movement building, the centrality of racial justice, and strategy moving forward?
I mean, I think that the climate movement has been very strong on direct action, but often in a particular part of the movement, which is basically the idea to keep fossil fuels in the ground. You know, really serious frontline struggles, often people of all, you know, people from all over coming to support indigenous communities, for instance, in fighting the Keystone XL pipeline or the Dakota Access Pipeline. And this famously, it was at the Standing Rock that AOC became kind of fully radicalized, and you know what she is now. So that's been great, and I think, you know, a frustration I get sometimes from folks in the anti-fossil fuel world is that the Green New Deal has tilted so much toward talking about investment that we've left out a little bit of the destruction of the fossil fuel industry as a core goal. And certainly dismantling the fossil fuel industry doesn't feature in the Democrats' plan. I think what we're seeing with the movement for Black Lives is that direct action isn't just for defense, for stopping things that you don't want. It is part of a fight for what you do want. And so the divest invest is like a double struggle. For on the one hand saying, police has to stop, you know, burn a police precinct. Like it's pretty clear what the demand is there. And at the same time, it is a fight for investment, and it has legs, and it's sustained itself, and it's filling space. So I think we're learning from the movement for Black Lives how to put something on the agenda. But I also think our job is not just to learn from them, but to work with them. And I think that one thing that doesn't look so great through the lens of this current uprising is the specificity with which the Green New Deal movement hasn't really talked about bringing jobs and community benefits to frontline communities, and in particular Black communities. I think we, and I'm certainly guilty of this myself, have often talked about, yes, we're going to invest disproportionately in frontline communities. Look at some great examples from California. But the fact of the matter is that we've had two major welfare state kind of expansion efforts in the US in the 20th century, the New Deal and the War on Poverty. And both of them failed miserably to bring significant benefits to Black communities. And that means that we don't have off the shelf any tools, reliable tools, to bring serious benefits to Black communities. So there are small things. Obviously, we know that public institutions are better than the market for this. Decarbonizing and saving the Postal Service would help a lot of Black workers. Expanding the public sector would help Black workers. Jobs for public housing residents would help Black workers because they live in public housing. But I think that we, and I was trying to allude to this a bit in my talk, we have to spend a lot more time together, the Green New Deal movement, the eco-socialist movement, and the movement for Black Lives. And in that time, and through a mutual commitment, then we'll come up with the bullet points that we need. And we have to do a study of history also. And we have to recognize that whatever we have said about the investments we want to bring to communities of color have not been enough. And we know that they've not been enough because if they had been, the movement for Black Lives would have them on their placards, and they don't. So we have a lot of work to do to catch up with history right now, and in particular in this Black Lives struggle.
I'm just going to add something super brief. I think that was really comprehensive and captured a lot of the ways that I feel about it. Just to sort of underline one point that Daniel mentioned a bit at the beginning around the impacts of direct action and disruption. I think one thing to learn from the current Black uprising, though there are some examples of it from the climate justice movement as well, is the rapidity at which, especially in a moment of just intersecting crises, including a legitimacy crisis of the state itself, that like in a moment of intersecting crises, the rapidity at which you can actually shape public opinion, shape the policy conversation, shape the parameters that elites feel like they have to operate within, and that we should just never take like an opinion poll or like how voters voted in one state once or like who happens to be in power when as like some kind of natural law of like this is just what the people want and like we have to adjust ourselves to it. Like we should be protagonists, we should be thinking of politics as an outcome of our struggles, not just as a constraint on our struggles. And I think there's no better set of movements over the long 20th century to draw that lesson from than the struggle for Black freedom, including the one unfolding right now. Though I also think that the climate justice movement has been wise to that and has been, intervening and reshaping what people think about climate in general, climate change in general, but also rethinking what's possible. And the popularity of the Green New Deal is a testament to that. But again, the popularity of the Green New Deal isn't enough. And I'll just underline what Daniel said about needing to get really concrete about how a Green New Deal addresses racialized poverty and the racialized class structure in our country, but also doing that through alliance building and coalition building that is organic and that is ground up. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you both. So this has been quite an eventful year, and I feel like it'd be remiss for us not to talk a little bit about the pandemic. A number of op-eds have been published drawing parallels between the coronavirus emergency response and the response needed for the climate emergency. However, there hasn't been much discussion on the role that labor strikes and union pressure played in mobilizing a government response to the pandemic. Are there lessons that socialists and climate activists can learn from the role of labor in mobilizing government action on COVID? How might the role of labor in catalyzing a government response to the climate emergency differ, and what steps do we need to take to make it happen?
That's an awesome. There's a book in answering your question properly, which I don't think I will manage. But I think just to sort of circle back, the Green New Deal movement I think of as really standing on like the shoulders of giants, and those giants I think are the environmental justice movement, which has been going for decades, fighting against the pollution and poisoning in Black communities itself, an outgrowth of the civil rights movement. And then the second is the just transition movement within labor. And labor is not a monolith. We're not going to win this without labor, but at the same time, obviously within labor movement, within unions, there is a struggle right now. And you have some very powerful elements supporting the Green New Deal and others that are a bit more reticent. So, I think there are some things to learn. Of course, when labor mobilizes, it has an incredible organizational capacity. Labor is unique in some ways on the left because it's funded by itself. It's not funded by the Ford Foundation. It's funded by workers' dues. And it's really helpful when you're fighting capital not to be funded by the bank accounts of capitalists. So labor has that capacity. It has a mobilizational capacity. I think we need to also really think with the effort within labor in the last decade or two to reach the unorganized. Only about 6% of private sector workers are in unions. A lot of the green jobs that we would get immediately would actually be in worker cooperatives, worker-owned businesses, which is not the same thing as labor unions. And you have within labor increasing discussions of the need to create worker centers, labor-centered campaigns that aren't just about unionized workers. So I think, yes, we can learn from the labor struggles around COVID. It's been very powerful. We can learn from unions like the Chicago Teachers Union, which is now thinking about a Green New Deal for schools. And one could come up with any number of examples. But I sort of feel at the end of the day, what it ultimately comes down to is we need to bring people together around a vision of work, which is compelling. Care work is green work. Transformation of the built environment is going to take a lot of work and so on. And we have to recognize that it's going to be very difficult without gaining some power to solidify all these coalitions. Spending money, public money, on things like decarbonizing the Postal Service will show postal workers that green jobs are not just a cliche. The Obama administration promised 5 million green jobs and delivered barely a fraction of that. So I think, we got to bring people together. We have to work with labor. But I think we have to not be naive and understand that we also need to work with politicians, and we need to get investments passed in order to really solidify the kind of common sense among workers that green investment is for them and will benefit them, and is not just something that is a nice idea, but fundamentally about Whole Foods or something for somebody else.
Another comprehensive answer. I will just add a little bit to say, and a super hard question, to kind of address every facet of, but just to underline one or two points. I think, part of what we saw happen with labor militancy during this COVID pandemic has been the role of workers in what we might call like sort of the care sectors, the sort of broadly the sectors that are essential for kind of social reproduction, right? And so like whether we're thinking about Instacart and the people that, and also like people in meatpacking plants, so like the people that put food on our tables, or whether we're thinking about nurses and healthcare workers or delivery workers, all of these types of workers that are essential in keeping us alive and healthy and fed. And those sectors also tend to be dominated by people of color, by immigrants, and by women, right? And so these are the sectors that are really at the, in many ways, growing sectors of the economy, regardless of what the Green New Deal does, right? We've been in a long period of deindustrialization, and so service sectors are larger. But it also happens to be where we've seen the most interesting worker militancy over the past few years. So in addition to this COVID moment and those, Instacart workers that went on strike and nurses that made bold demands, we've recently seen nurse strikes and teacher strikes over the past couple of years being some of the most vibrant parts of the labor movement. So I think, just to kind of pick up on what some points that Daniel made, like thinking about those workers who are struggling for their livelihoods, for their communities, but also some of whose work, like especially like the nursing and teaching work and the food workers' work, like would be really essential, though in a lower carbon and more dignified form, in a Green New Deal. And so like, how do we ally with those parts of the labor movement that are that are both more militant and that are also like closer to where we are at politically? I think where we often get tripped up in this labor question, I know Sid, you have written on this and you're like the expert among the three of us on this question about labor. Like the really difficult thing, of course, is workers in the fossil fuel sector. And how do you really prove to folks who have been let down time and again by this just transition, that I mentioned so casually in my talk, this idea of a just transition, they've been let down under the banner of a just transition many times, right? And so, and for other reasons that we could get into or not, like workers in some of those unions, or maybe even more like the leadership of those unions, has like some kind of conservative views about the energy transition. And it's a real set of dilemmas for socialists, like how do we work with this part of the labor movement? But I think what we do, that I'm not going to solve right now at all, but I do think that there are elements of the labor movement who are both more militant, more representative of the multiracial women-led working class, and also whose work is vital in a Green New Deal paradigm. That we can work with immediately. And I think, the labor movement is a big thing. And when you can get pieces of it on board, the other ones might follow a bit more. I think the hard thing is starting with the hardest to reach workers. And that probably shouldn't be the strategy at the same time that we do continue to work with those workers and move them and do rank and file work and political education work within those unions in terms of, the DSA members, for example, that are in the IBW, like they're doing great stuff. But like we can also work with other parts of the labor movement that are easier to reach probably.
Great answers from both of you. Thank you so much. So I have kind of a big question. So we know that global heating has already exceeded safe limits, and we simply don't have time for gradualists and so-called market-based solutions to the climate crisis. Even mainstream climate activists recognize the necessity of an immediate state-led intervention to mobilize the economy and resources towards addressing the climate emergency. And the possibility of a Bernie Sanders presidency gave many hope for the rollout of an effective and just mobilization. With Bernie out of the race and socialists lacking state power, what are the obstacles and risks we face? What role should socialists play in overcoming these obstacles? And are there lessons we can learn from history, either here or abroad?
I don't love the framework of co-optation because I think it's a little bit of a sloppy concept. I think there are forms of co-optation that are actually mean that we won something. And there are forms of co-optation that demobilize. And I think we need to sort of disambiguate that. that big caveat aside, I do think there is that risk with the lead up to the general election, but also in a what seems likely to be a Biden presidency, given how the polls are looking. I think our conversation about the climate crisis committee report already shows what those risks are. And so just to be clear and to sort of get at what I was saying about being more sophisticated about how we think about co-optation. I think on the one hand, like the fact that the Democratic Party felt the need to even produce this report is an indication that they are, taking young climate activists, climate left activists, like seriously as political actors. But on the other hand, the fact that they produce something that's so woefully inadequate means that we cannot like rest on our laurels. Like the second that it seems like they're moving towards us and we're getting a concession, and this is again something Daniel kind of mentioned earlier, like we actually need to like double down on what's working. And what's working is like escalation, is disruption, is bold demands, is visionary statements, it's making clear alliances with groups differentially kind of situated on the terrain, but like in favor of climate justice. And those are what's worked to get us to the point where finally the Democratic Party like admits there's a climate crisis, like a million years too late. But like, so I think that we need to be sophisticated about how to interact with like the kind of still centrist dominated, but deeply delegitimized kind of political context that we live in, and be like own the victories when we get them, but not like stop ever, and just sort of keep going because we've got a decade to kind of win this thing, as we argue in the book.
Yeah, thanks. That is a big question. I think the first thing is, where are we? The fact that Biden won and not Buttigieg or even Klobuchar is telling. Like Biden is, I guess, I might get my theory wrong. It's sort of like a simulacrum. I mean, he's like a representation of a representation of a representation of neoliberalism or something. There's nothing there. And it's telling that to beat Bernie, they had to come up with essentially like an empty bag, and stretched bag also at this point. And so that means we're in a very strange situation. Like, I think, to go to like Marxist theory, state theory, Poulan family says the state is a condensate of class struggle. So the state isn't a thing, but is like the whole terrain of struggle, and that the balance of forces within the state tells you about the balance of forces generally. And so under Biden, who will not be obviously a strong leader if he wins, and hope that he does, obviously, if Biden wins, there will be, I think, an opportunity to see where we are and to make things happen, right? Like Biden is not coming in like Obama. Biden is not coming in like Bill Clinton. There's no one in Biden's orbit who's out there making an evangelical case for neoliberal market action, for new public management, you name it. It is a very, very kind of like, Thea said, milquetoast, because it's sort of like a non-aggressive sort of situation. So that does mean, I think there's a certain amount of struggle that we can make. And it also means, this is the optimistic reading would be that even though the formal apparatus is a bit different, that we're still in essentially we would be in the phase of US politics very similar to what things looked like in Latin America before the pink tide governments of Lula, Evo Morales, Chavez, and so on, where the old political establishment had essentially dissolved, right? So you have, for instance, like in 2002, I think, Evo Morales scoring 19% in a presidential election, around tied for third or second, basically. And then in 2005, winning with 53% of the vote, the biggest majority in decades in Bolivia, and then going on to expand the electorate and winning a number of victories, with absolutely crushing majorities, because the whole previous formal political system had essentially no ties to society and crumbled. And you see examples of this once you come down in the US to the regional level, right? You look at New York, DSA, incredible success in getting people elected. AOC, Salazar reelected with massive margins against well-funded incumbents. In Philadelphia, we talked about labor. The electricians union, a kind of old school white trades union, endorses Nikhil Sabal, a DSA-endorsed Green New Deal candidate. He crushes an incumbent from a long dynasty of Italian-American state senators in this region. And what you see is the Philadelphia Democratic Party, which is this like storied institution, big machine, is just getting absolutely slaughtered in election after election, even to the point where you had, so this guy, Johnny Dock, who effectively runs Local 98 Electricians, says, in these times, one of our great left-wing labor publications, he says, look, the future is the Green New Deal. It's coming faster than you think. And he moves with that future, and that's Nikhil. And by the way, when Joe Biden comes to Pennsylvania looking for votes, he's going to need socialists to produce those votes for him, because the old group that was supposed to produce votes didn't turn out very well in 2016 for Hillary, and they can't even get themselves elected now in Philly. So all this to say, I think you have essentially like a dissolving party machine. You don't see a strength in a Buttigieg or a Klobuchar of a kind of neoliberal like avant-garde, which I think should make us feel good. And I think you'll see Biden occupying a state that will express the contradictions of our times. And so I look ahead and I think, would it be better if Bernie had won? Yes. But is it impossible on this timeline to decarbonize, cut emissions in the US by 25 to 50% by 2030? I don't think it's impossible. I think that the 2023 primary will start the day, hopefully after Biden is elected. Nationally, there will be fights in Congress. We'll have people like Jamal Bowman connecting the dots between the Green New Deal and the movement for Black Lives. And most important, it won't just be him, but he and AOC and others are movement candidates, Tlaib, Omar, etc., who come to Congress with movements behind them and are fundamentally accountable to those movements for their own political survival. So I don't know. I see like a lot of bad stuff happening in the everyday, but step one bit back and you see the political kind of machine that rules this country actually very weak. Obviously, Trump and the Republicans is weak leadership. Biden Democrats, weak leadership. And the decade is ours to win.
The decade is ours to win. That's wonderful. I'm gonna actually think that transitions well to an audience question from Evie Morrow. And just so you all know, we only have a few minutes left, but Evie Morrow asks, is it possible to truly force a swift move to prevent ecological disaster under this current model of capitalism? Do we see coming victories, and can they come soon enough?
Yeah, big question. I mean, one of the ways that we tackle this in A Planet to Win is we kind of say, like, right in the first few pages that obviously, and as this listener agrees, capitalism is at the root of the climate crisis. I think there's no way around recognizing that and arguing that. But, there have been sort of, I actually think we've come a long way on the socialist left about getting more complex about this. But I remember sort of debates in like the past years, like, do we abolish capitalism first and then do the socialism? This sort of like sequential kind of like binary thinking where it's like and what the Green New Deal opens up is the possibility, and this kind of echoes some things Daniel said earlier about the Green New Deal being this opening sort of to an eco-socialist future, not being eco-socialism in and of itself, but it like opens up the idea that you do both things at once, right? And so like the way that you decarbonize is not like decarbonize first and then deal with the fact that the utilities are privately controlled, or make them public and then deal with the fact that they're fossil fuel heavy, but like in the same motion, like with the same set of demands, with the same pieces of legislation or statutes or regulations, like make something public and make it decarbonized at the same time, right? And so, sometimes there are tensions and there are trade-offs and there are difficulties. I don't want to make it sound like it all fits together perfectly, but like overall, I think our kind of belief is that like democracy and low carbon reinforce one another, right? So like taking democratic control over the economy and making the economy something that isn't like killing people through emissions are like part of the same process. And we need to just try to think about doing two things at once, because we don't have the time to have like a fossil fueled revolution and then deal with decarbonization. Not that the listener is suggesting that, but like just to make the extreme, sort of make the point by taking it to the extreme. And I think, yeah, the Green New Deal is a paradigm that helps bring those two sets of goals together.
Yeah, and I would just add quickly, the DSA endorsed this idea of a green stimulus. It endorsed the people's bailout. I think the DSA has reached a level of, I hate to use the word maturity, but sort of like it's grown to a point where there are 70,000 members, and where nationally they are now standing up and pushing this kind of left flank of political combat all across the country. And DSA members are calling Congress people, demanding a green stimulus to lift up workers and communities and make green change. And so I think we as a movement, as a socialist movement, are learning how to fight the big long-term fight, the ideological fight, and the kind of trench war in DC and in local races all at the same time. That's incredible. And as we learn to really use our membership and grow well beyond 100,000 members very quickly, we're going to be a political force without parallel. And I actually don't think the challenge is per se how to thread all these questions theoretically. I think it's simply working with, in a tighter and more coordinated way with the movement for Black Lives, merging our struggles. And I don't know, you couldn't ask for like better progress in this front in the last couple of years. I think we're making huge advances and should feel very good about it.
Thank you both. So we are right at the end of our time together. I just want to thank both of you for being here. It is always really, really wonderful to have the opportunity to speak with you. I really appreciate your organizing work. I appreciate your policy work. And I appreciate how you're speaking out on this issue during this time that feels so dangerous, but filled with revolutionary possibility. I want to turn it over to you for any closing remarks. And again, thanks you both for being here.
I will pick up a little bit where Daniel left off about DSA and just do a plug, which is like, if you're not a member of DSA, join DSA right now. What are you doing? It's the biggest socialist organization in the United States in like a million years. If you're in DSA and you're not sure where to plug in, but you're listening to this talk and so sensibly you're concerned about the climate crisis, join the Eco-Socialist Working Group. You can do that from our webpage. There's Green New Deal stuff to work on. There's energy democracy stuff. There's agroecology stuff. There's local stuff. There's national stuff. There is everything. We're a super active working group and very internally democratic and fun to be involved in. So those are my plugs. Get involved.
Wow, thanks. I mean, I think that it's just very hard in the climate movement to have the kind of dual realities of our current political situation and the climate emergency at the same time. And we all know who will suffer first and worst from global heating. Like you said, we've already reached safe limits. I mean, every molecule of carbon dioxide we emit, a quarter of those will be in the air for thousands of years, and some of those for tens of thousands of years, longer than Stonehenge has lasted. So we have irrevocably transformed the Earth in ways that we don't know how to deal with. And we're now trying to decelerate that change and ultimately to stabilize it before it's kind of too late for a massive, massive, massive tragedy. So I don't know. I think that is very, very, very difficult. And there's no question that we're not moving quickly enough. And it's really, in a way, impossible politically to move quickly enough. I think all that being said, if we dial back the clock politically to where we were a decade ago, I mean, during Occupy Wall Street, it wasn't clear that anybody should get elected to lead a meeting. And big surprise, those meetings sort of dissolved. We had the People's Climate March in 2014 that did not mention carbon. There was no discussion of carbon in the official symbology of the People's Climate March. It only came the next day with Flood Wall Street. That was only 6 years ago. 2016, the Bernie campaign, climate change plays a part in it, but it was notional. It was a few bullet points. There was no, I think, serious, sophisticated conversation about what a socialist decarbonization of the United States would look like. We've come so far. We've built our movements so much just in the last few years. I think we are building our movements faster than the oil industry is gaining power. It's in fact losing power, losing market share, losing money. So I don't know. I think the challenge for each of us is to just every day get up out of bed, hold the reality of the climate calendar in one place, and then with that information, turn that into constructive energy to build a movement, make strategic decisions, know that whatever happens today, there's a tomorrow. So I don't know. I think we are in a really good place. This decade remains up for grabs for ours. We can have a decade of the Green New Deal. We won't have it without socialists. So please, join this fight. And Thea's given you a bunch of really great ways how to do that. Thank you. Thank you so much for this incredible moderation and panel. Amazing questions. We'll all be thinking about it for thousands of years.
Thank you. Thank you both. And again, another shout out, join DSA. We only have this moment. So, and you were born just in time to be revolutionary. So act now. Anyway, we're going to close out here. Thanks so much, everybody. And I hope you have a great weekend.